All right. Well, hello there, and welcome to the Deadly Analysis Podcast. In case you're new to this podcast, this is a place where our analyses of horror films are considered, well, they're considered hypnotic, if you will. They're spellbinding in a lot of ways, influential, if you will, which sort of is like an amazing segue. I don't know how that happened, just an amazing segue into the film we're going to be discussing tonight. Who'd have thought? Tonight we're discussing what may arguably be the very first horror film ever made, and that's The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which is an early German expressionist film from the 1920s, in which a man named Francis relates a story about his best friend Alan and his fiancée Jane. And Alan takes Francis to a fair where they meet Dr. Caligari, a man who exhibits a somnambulist, Cesare. And Cesare is a kind of, how do I put this? A kind of sleepwalker that's under Dr. Caligari's control. And Cesare can apparently predict the future. And so when Alan asks at this sort of carnival how long that he has to live, which is one of those things we all want to know, Cesare says that you're kind of screwed, dude. You have until dawn, which is like the worst answer you could ever hear. Like, that just sucks, right? And so, alas, the prophecy comes to pass, and Alan actually is murdered that evening, and Cesare ends up becoming the prime suspect. Cesare then creeps later on into the evening into Jane's bedroom in what to me is like one of the most iconic and I think the greatest scenes in horror film history. And he ends up abducting her and running from the townspeople, and then finally, I guess, dying of exhaustion is the way the film attempts to portray it. Meanwhile, the police discover that in Cesare's cabinet, there's actually a dummy, not Cesare himself. And so Dr. Caligari is suspect at this point, and he flees, and Francis tracks Dr. Caligari to a mental asylum where he ends up being the director of the damn thing. Which is a wild twist. Dr. Caligari is then subdued and ironically becomes part of the same insane asylum that he directs. And then that's not even really the twist of this film. The twist of this film is that we go all the way back to Francis telling the story, like at the beginning. And it turns out that Francis, that he's actually part of the insane asylum. Like, he's in the insane asylum. So is Jane. And so is Cesare. And so is the director, who Francis just continually cries out and swears is Dr. Caligari. And that is the film. I mean, to me, like, what a wild and like intricate film made, especially at the dawn of cinema. I mean, what a very complex and complicated film. To me, this is legitimately one of my favorite horror films ever. In fact, so much so that I ended up almost naming this podcast. I know a lot of people in this room right now know this. I almost named this podcast, instead of the Deadly Analysis Podcast, Caligari's Credenza. It's almost like a 1920s What's in the Box, right? Like, we know Cesare is in the box, but I don't know, it's just something. This movie just really did it for me, and I actually have like unfinished like podcast artwork where I actually have like the logo popping out of a box, kind of like Cesare, which is it's actually done in like MS Paint, so it's super ghetto, but whatever. So anyway, I'm here tonight with Ben and with Shayra and with Jim, and we're going to be talking about the 1920 German expressionist horror film, one of the first horror films ever made, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. So just throw this out there. What did you guys think of the movie? Besides the fact that like there was more fade in and fade outs than like a home movie that was made in like Windows Movie Maker by your grandmother like 10 years ago. Like, the most fade in and outs of a film I've ever seen to this day. But besides that, we're going to skip that. We're going to give them the benefit of the doubt. Early film, I get it. Besides that, what did you guys think of this movie? I'll just kind of throw that out there.
I enjoyed it. I thought it was, this is actually the first time I've seen the film. I don't know how I've gone through my entire film education without seeing it. It's
Blasphemy. Blasphemy.
Yeah, it's actually really upsetting. It makes me angry at my early teachers for not exposing me to this film beforehand. And I think that as we sort of get into, I know there are a lot of probably listeners and a lot of my fellow podcasters, my colleagues, who like this might be an early foray into silent film. And what is fantastic about this, as I'm watching, as we watch these silent films, we see different filmmakers talking to each other. We see the way the art direction and even Dutch angles and close-ups are used in this film that then get picked up later on. This is, as I was watching this, I was like, oh, wow. So that's where Metropolis got most of its ideas. And Metropolis, for those of you who don't know, is like the first science fiction film ever. And it's phenomenal. Metropolis is phenomenal, and so is the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. What's you noted very correctly about all of the twists and turns. This is incredibly complex storytelling for the time. At the time, these were we had rather simple stories. Great Train Robbery, for example. People steal shit and run away from the cops, and then get caught. That's the basic plot of these things. So the fact that we have twists and turns and stories within a story, this is cutting edge for 1920. And so that was one of the things, as a student of film and film history, this was fantastic to go back and see some of the early ways in which film is being used uniquely to tell stories uniquely. So,
sorry if you hear a cat in the background. He's, I don't know, meowing a whole bunch. So I was trying not to talk while he's meowing, but he's gonna keep going. So, this is a great movie because it's full of tropes, but it wasn't tropey then, and it was all borrowed from, like, people borrowed from it. When I first watched this movie, I was like, well, there's Tim Burton. There's the Penguin. Obviously, Dr. Caligari is the Penguin. I'm a huge Batman fan, so that was exciting. And also finding out that the Sleepwalker, the actor who plays him, later on he was in The Man Who Laughed. I think that's what it's called. Something along those lines. But he's like this creepy face that looks exactly like the Joker. Well, that inspired the Joker. So there's a lot of things that inspired Batman, which I'm a huge fan of. Tim Burton stuff I'm a huge fan of, so obviously there. So it's like you never met your mother, growing up, and then you all of a sudden get to meet her, and you're like, all this makes so much sense, and it's so beautiful, and I love this, and it feels nostalgic and wonderful and happy and creepy as all holy hell. Like, it's very scary, but the effects are amazing, and it's just every time I watch it, I see something new and interesting and weird, and that's great. I love this movie so much.
Yeah, this is the original How I Met Your Mother. Like, we should just lead with that. Yeah, totally. Like, if you're a horror fan, this is How I Met Your Mother.
I've got to say that this is only the second silent film that I've ever seen, and the last one, of course, was going to be The Phantom Carriage. And really, it's through this podcast that I'm kind of being exposed to some of this older cinema. So that's really the basis of my comparison here. Like, I'm trying to keep in context what this movie is for the time period and, among its peers, you might say. But it's easy to forget how old it is. So when I'm thinking of The Phantom Carriage, which actually came out later, this particular film seems much more modern. And I think a lot of that does have to do with the complexity and the storytelling and the fact that they were able to tell such a complex story, which it can't be an easy thing to do when you're working with title cards. You have no dialogue. It all has to be portrayed visually. And the masterful aspect of that, I think, that shines above kind of like anything else really for me when I'm watching this is the fact that, yes, at the end you find out that kind of your storyteller, your narrator, for lack of a better word, even though it's not being narrated, it's kind of the guy that's expressing the tale. The fact that he's inside of a mental asylum, I think, really just they hint at that through the distortion of the reality that he's describing, right? Like the entire world, the angles and the perspective, it's all messed up. It almost seems very surreal, but I suppose you could call that an expressionism. I think it really ties into giving you that context that this is a person who is envisioning this world who is, you know, mentally twisted. And then that comes through so well in the way they portray all of the shots, all of the scenes. It's beautiful. And I can't say enough good things about this. Honestly, the fact that you know, you have almost what might seem like an abuse of power from the psychological world. Of course, like you have these horrors that tie back into life in an asylum and the way that was in the early stages of psychology. You have all of those elements as well, which is very appealing to me as kind of a, you know, someone who has their degree in psychology, right? So like a lot of that history there sort of makes a lot of sense. Not to mention the hypnotism. There are questions about the end of the film whenever Dr. Caligari comes forth and says he has the perfect treatment to make his patient kind of like stop acting, you know, so crazy. And you have questions about what that might be. And maybe, you know, maybe he's not so crazy after all. Maybe he did see something, but the doctor's just kind of messing with him. You know, I don't know. It really, it sets me thinking. And that's a great, I mean, that's a sign that I'm watching a fantastic film. If it's able to do that to me, if it's able to make me think, that's something I really look for whenever I'm watching movies, to find something that I'm going to rate highly. But this has all of that. And it's unbelievable to think that they were able to package all of these elements that I look for in films that are released today in 2017, able to do that in 1920.
Yeah, this film's really like Shutter Island, but better, right? The Martin Scorsese came out with Shutter Island probably about 10 years ago, and all of the things that happen in Shutter Island happen in the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and yet Dr. Caligari almost seems so much more. Caligari had me twisted in ways that Shutter Island did. Like the twist ending of Caligari worked on me in a way that a lot of the twists in modern cinema haven't. And it's almost like we seem to be expecting twists. And I was not expecting the twist in Caligari. And it's been a while since a film twisted and got me. And I miss that feeling. Like, where did that go away? So I think that, you know, and part of that is because I was expecting the sort of straightforward story that silent film is known for. Silent film is not known for twisting at all. And this, I think I've seen probably about 40 silent films, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. But this, I think, is the only silent film that I've seen that had a twist ending. And that's a profound innovation in film storytelling, and part of the reason why this is so highly rated by Noah and many professional critics.
Yeah, the twist was really fun to watch the teenagers, because, you know, I watched it with the teenagers to see their reactions. So I'm sitting there waiting when the first twist comes along, and they're like, "Wait, what? Whoa!" And I'm like, "Just wait for it." You know, and then it gets to the end, and they're like, "Wait, she's a queen? Wait, what's happening? What? No!" You know, and it's so fun to watch the reaction from people when they see that it's a twist, and then another twist. And the fact that it was in such an old film where, I mean, it's almost expected to see those kinds of twists, and obviously with M. Night Shyamalan, like, everybody expects twists in his films too now. This was way better than Shyamalan, though. And if anybody wants to say he's the master of twists, or he's the one who... No, this is the one. This is the one. So it was fun watching people's reactions for the first time. And if you haven't seen it, you know, go watch it, and then go watch it with some friends and watch their reaction, because that was probably more satisfying than watching it the first time I watched it.
And if you haven't seen it, I'm really sorry that we spoiled it for you.
Yeah, you're screwed. You're absolutely screwed. And I'm happy that we're screwed.
I had Seventh Sense kind of screwed for me, so oh well.
Sixth Sense, you mean?
Yeah, Sixth Sense, whatever.
I'm like, Seventh Sense. There's a sequel I don't know of. Like, what's happening here?
That would be a great sequel,
like,
yeah.
What's happening here? That would be amazing. Shyamalan, if you're out there, you got a new idea. Seventh Sense. Done.
The Seventh Sense is a mashup with Interstellar, where he tells everything through a bookcase. He taps out the secrets of the universe in Morse code.
Or it could be a mashup of Seven and Seventh Sense. So we have the Seven Deadly Sins.
Shit. That is some scary shit. You guys all kind of hit the nail on the head. I mean, so the expectation when you watch this film, especially like place yourself in the 1920s, where everything is so logical and there's a rational style of filmmaking, and then you have this expressionist style where everything is like imagination over experience, right? Including the ending. So, you know, we slightly touched on like the really bizarre set design, which should be our first indicator that like the story we're hearing is a sense of artificiality in it, right? Like everything, like this, all particular pieces of the set are hand drawn. I don't know if you guys know that, which is wild. Like a particular angles of the hallways and of the roads, they all seem off and distorted. Shadows are hand drawn in, and they're a lot longer, like bigger than they ought to be. Like shadows are actually painted on the sense, and this was kind of like the first indicator that the narrator is sort of unreliable. This is one of the first films in which the narrator is unreliable. Nowadays, you sort of always have to have that question in the background: is the narrator reliable, right? This is one of the first in which that question was ever posed. And it was done so fucking well that looking back on this, I just, this really does belong in like the annals of this sort of like perfection, like horror perfection, making you think like, what? There's almost a couple twists in this film that make you just leave going, like, if you're used to a very rational 1-to-1 sort of ratio with what you're seeing and the way the world is, this movie is going to distort that for you, which gets us into maybe a kind of a social critique, which I guess we could get into. But just from a purely cinematic perspective, the uniqueness of that is just surreal to watch, even in 2017. One of the major appeals for me in this film.
I do want to pick up on that a little bit, but I also want to talk about the theaters and sort of as you were talking about how, if we were as a 2017 audience are trying to put ourselves into the place of a 1920 1920s filmgoer, we should realize that these are, when they go to the cinema, they're going to these really ornate Baroque kind of buildings, and this is called the movie palace era from 1915 to 1925. It's the movie palace era where the theaters were essentially palaces. They're not like your regular Regal cinemas or AMCs that you would go to today, where they're rather bland bullshit architecture. These were painted walls and you know, think Baroque churchy kind of thing. And so audiences would go there thinking that this was the time to let their imagination wander. This was the time to allow imagination to be exercised. It's some of the earliest films in around the turn of the century were Georges Millet films, where people were like going to the moon, and it was once again all about the craziness of imagination. So for a 1920s audience, the idea that we could allow our imagination to have free expression in a film like Dr. Caligari isn't too much outside of the bounds. What is outside of the bounds is the construction of the storytelling, and then, as you were saying, all of the attention to detail in the art direction. That's almost wholly unique in film cinema history, to Caligari, and then it gets the world gets upended 7 years later in Metropolis again. So yeah, I think that if when we put our heads into a 1920s audience, we also have to think about the building and the whole. And there's I forgot there's a fucking orchestra right there too. Like 80-piece orchestra. So it's a real production. Like it's a real event kind of thing that these film goers were treated to when they went to see Caligari at the beginning. So.
Yeah. I was going to say the closest analog for me, dude, is I saw Lord of the Rings with an orchestra, and it was like a kind of orgasm. It's the best way I could put it. It was just an amazing cinematic experience.
And that's the type of thing that, yeah, that's exactly. I think Lord of the Rings is similar to, and you had somebody dressed up as Gandalf sitting next to you, right? Or if you didn't, then you were the one.
Yeah, no, yeah. I was going to say that was my wife, but yes,
right.
yes.
But yeah, I mean, I think you're right, both in terms of the cinematic, what's special about this cinematically. But then I thought, here's some historical context as well. But yeah, anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it makes the audience ponder what's real. And I really dug that. It's one of the earliest instantiations of asking the question, what's really going on, right? Like, how can the somnambulist be in two places at once, for example, when we find out that Cesare is in the, that it's a dummy, right, in the cabinet, and that he's really out there going after Jane. I mean, that sort of thing is one of the earliest instantiations of asking those questions. Wait a minute, how's this going on? And we can think of a billion and one movies in which that exists now, but to see the earliest instantiation of that and to not expect it. I mean, I went into this thinking very linearly, thinking very Phantom Carriage-esque, which is a great film, but compared to this, it's very linear. It's very obvious, it's otherworldly in a lot of respects, but it's still very linear compared to this. This is a kind of Alice in Wonderlandish sort of weird out there, has a sort of weird appeal that makes you think maybe not everything as what it seems, So, I mean, yeah. So for what it's worth.
So how did you read the end, Noah? Did you read the end as Caligari's on the up and up kind of psychiatrist who's doing fine, or doing patient care well? Or did you think that there was some sort of nefariousness to his character by the end? Because I think that there's a last push in on him that it's not a real push in, but they close the lens.
Fade in. Yeah. They fade in on him, as though that happens a lot throughout the film. Not a lot. Yeah, I mean, it makes you wonder, right? There really is no definitive answer. I like to think that a part of me likes to think that if they would have had Caligari smile a little bit more, like if he would have looked at the camera and had that little fucking twinkle in his eye, I would have been like, oh, that son of a bitch. But I actually think that Francis was kind of insane. I do. That's how I think the film was meant to make me feel. Which is part of my criticism for the movie. I guess we'll kind of hop to that. I know Ben, I can tell Ben and Shayro want to hop into some of the earlier things we were saying. But yeah, like that to me was part of the things I didn't like about the film, is that I feel like the film would have had more of a thrust, more of a robust push in some of the, maybe the more social critique, if they would have removed that sort of the depth of that sort of level. But to answer your question, I actually think the film wants me to think that Francis was crazy. That's my appeal for the ending. That's my the way I interpret the ending. I'm really curious to think, or to see how you guys think how this ended.
I honestly think that it's okay. So I haven't seen any director's notes. I haven't read any like official reviews of this or any official positions. So I could be completely off. That's totally fine. I'm willing to risk that. I think the design may have been just based on the rest of the film to be truly open-ended. So I know in classes in college and in high school, they introduce you to stories where they're left incomplete on purpose, just to get in your head and like really make you think about what could the ending possibly be, but there is no real ending. I think this might be kind of the same, because most of the movies seem to be positioned in such a way to leave you a little bit confused and kind of like throw you off so you don't really know what's going on. I would love it if there was some sort of like nefariousness there. Like obviously I alluded to that, I think, a little bit before. That would be my preference, but secretly I think it is a little bit better that there's no smile. There's no indication. All you get is this nice, drawn out, slow look at his face with no other hint. It's subtle. It's there. It's just enough to make you wonder. Just enough.
I think they were all insane. And I don't even mean it as a joke, but it is kind of funny. But I really do think all of them were completely mad. And I think it was brought together in the end when he's walking around talking to all the people. They all seem pretty messed up. Even the doctors are probably a little screwed up from some of the stuff they've probably experienced. And I know that There's a lot of allegory to this film. I know that they're talking about tyrants, tyranny, all that shit. You see a lot of power in their hats or in the chairs they sit on. You know, the more power they have, the higher their hat. The more power they have, the higher their chair. And trying to bring down the big man. And I think what it all boils down to is we're all mad down here. Like, it's very Alice in Wonderland kind of world. You know, they're all completely batshit insane. And to what degree is really what the question is, right? So
that clerk had the biggest chair I've ever seen in my, like, that clerk, that was obscene. That guy, have you ever wanted to like kick one of the feet of a chair and just see what happens when that clerk was up there?
Somehow it really just made me want to, just like a giant cigar. I don't know. Like, I just wanted to go to my local tobacconist and just pick up a massive stogie. I don't know why.
Oh no, I get it. Yeah. Yep. I totally get that.
That's so important to bring up, though, like, because I get the same feeling when I watch Alice in Wonderland type movies or even music videos some people borrow from. I feel like they were on drugs, and I know it's probably not true, but I feel like these people were on some seriously awesome drugs when they made this, because it's so trippy and so weird, and kind of reminds me of, you know, the 60s and the 70s when a lot of the film was really bizarre. I mean, when we look at Pink Floyd's The Wall, I know that the production design team, they loved this film and they borrowed some ideas from it. But of course you could say the same thing about the 90s. You got Beetlejuice, they borrowed ideas from that, and Edward Scissorhands, they borrowed ideas from it, and even Batman. So I guess the 80s and 90s still have some tripped out shit, but the 60s and 70s had some really bizarre films that came out, and this made me feel that way. And that's why, even though we're watching a movie that's almost 100 years old, I feel like it was way ahead of its time, because it does not feel like it fits in that time period at all.
All right, so one thing I really want to ask about too, just going back to the speculating about the ending a little bit, one thing that I think we should add in there is maybe some questions about the story of the original Dr. Caligari that they talk about, you know, when they get into his office and they're reading from the book. And so, like, there's this supposed theory there, and there's an importance as to why they have to get a somnambulist or a sleepwalker, I guess, in common parlance, you could call this kind of person. Why is that important? So obviously there are elements of hypnotism here, and it's sort of assumed that Dr. Caligari has some sort of hypnotic control, I think, or at least that was my impression. So maybe it's possible that this type of person is going to be a little bit more susceptible to hypnotic suggestion. Now, when you think about this in real theory, and surprise as it may be to some, hypnotism is still used in modern therapy techniques to this day. You know, maybe to help you stop smoking, or, you know, maybe to help you forget your like phantom limb syndrome, or, you know, things like that. And there's research to suggest that it actually works. But to the extent that you can make somebody go and kill somebody else, no, it's not going to be there. So I think the underlying theory here might be that, you know, this type of person who is sort of like in a half dream-like state already might be more open to this type of suggestion, which also might sort of lead me to think, okay, well, if there is any ground for this whatsoever, if this doctor actually has these sort of this skill of hypnotism and is able to do this to some of his patients, it seems like it would be possible to suggest certain things like false memories, or like the distortion of memory, or to make somebody express things so wildly that they do seem crazy. You know, of course, like I know that it is left a little bit ambiguous, and we don't really know whether or not the doctor actually had any sort of nefarious goals in mind. But, you know, maybe there's some credibility there just based on the way that they outline kind of like that theory right in the middle of the story.
So that's interesting. I mean, do you really, like, Ben, and I got to ask you, you're the authority here compared to all four of us, but like, is it really true that hypnotism can do those sorts of things even now? Like, I'm super curious about this. This is one of the things I wanted to ask you is, like, is it true that, so for example, hypnotism can actually, like smoking, like helping stop people from smoking. Hypnotism can actually do that. Like, there's actual demonstrable scientific proof that that's actually something that changes your behavior.
So it's going to be the soft sciences, of course, like the social sciences, right? So like, take that. It's not exactly physics or anything, but yeah, I mean, there's a strong body of research to suggest that there is some sort of reproducible effect there, where you can suggest certain thoughts, attitudes, beliefs, feelings into another person. and kind of change their behaviors over time if they're kind of open to it, I guess I would say.
So is it like a suggestive state? I mean, I clearly Caligari, the whole thing in Caligari is very expressive and probably not factual to the way it actually works with hypnotism. But like, so are people in like a suggestive state? Like, is that actually how it? I'm super curious to how this actually works. So if I wanted to lose, for example, if I was a smoker, I'm not a smoker, but if I was and I wanted to lose that, does it work the same sort of way? I mean, clearly we're not going to push it to, hey, go out and kill somebody and yada yada. But like, is it that actually works? Like, there's actual demonstrable proof that works. That's crazy to me. I didn't know that.
Right, and like the real method there, I mean, it does start off with getting somebody into a very relaxed state, a very sort of guard down kind of state where, I mean, you're commonly going to be sitting there. You're going to be having some sort of like visualization of your muscles relaxing, starting with the tips of your fingers, working up your arms and down your legs and so on and so forth. And like the very first step there is to get somebody where you are kind of almost like half asleep, and that sort of like that filter comes down, right? Like you don't have kind of like that sort of executive function that everything passes through whenever you're, ingesting a belief, whenever you're about to say something. That fades out just enough that you become a little bit more suggestible to whatever the authority figure is trying to feed you.
And by the end of this podcast, I quit smoking.
I was about to say, it literally was my whole lead-in. Like, I'm watching Jim
right.
move, and I'm like, that's the only reason I'm saying this. Yeah.
Well, I know there's a fact that they've shown that you can actually think you've been abducted by aliens, or that you even have like a family on some kind of alien planet, that people have used hypnosis to implant thoughts in others. Of course, they say that they're just reliving stuff, but it's thought implantation. So these people really legitimately believe that they've been sexually interacting with their alien family on another planet just out of hypnotic suggestions. So I would imagine if you can convince somebody that they've gone to another planet, fucked an alien, and had some alien babies with them, that it's very easy to see that other things could be suggested to people.
All right, so my wife is currently on Mars, so I resent that. I resent that heavily. Thank you.
Well, she's going to come back with some alien babies. Ben, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is what I understand of hypnosis research is you won't believe or you won't do anything that you wouldn't do otherwise. Like it's just that hypnosis sort of greases the path rather than make something like, so if I see this in like celebrity hypnotists or comedy hypnotists, like if you're not willing to do the thing that the hypnotist would command you to do normally, then you wouldn't do it under hypnosis. This isn't some magic thing, but it's based upon what your natural predilections are. Is that right, Ben?
Yeah, it's definitely not magic, and that is kind of the sort of rule of thumb there, and the easiest way to explain what's going on is to say that, yeah, I mean, if they're going to be unwilling to sort of acquiesce to a particular request or idea, generally speaking, yeah, I mean, they're not going to just do something entirely opposite to their character. Now, I mean, that's going to be probably because the actual mechanism of suggestion is going to be a rather soft influence, and of course you have cognitive structures built up of like pre-existing beliefs, and there's an entire sort of defense mechanism there that comes into play to protect all of that. And so if you come into direct conflict with some of those highly deep-seated beliefs and ideas and so on and so forth, then yeah, I mean, you're not going to have very much success in your suggestions.
Now, this is making me kind of want to see Stir of Echoes, but hypnosis aside, sleep is also a very weird, suggestive place too, and as a person who suffers night terrors, and my daughter also suffers, so I'm able to explain it to her what's actually happening, and has made it a lot less scary for her. But I didn't have that growing up, so basically night terrors are when you fall asleep and you're still kind of awake, but you're not. Your body is still completely paralyzed, like what happens to you when you're asleep, but you can look around the room and you usually see like a shadow man or like some kind of creature coming to you. This is why a lot of people believe aliens have visited them. For me, I thought I was seeing demons because I was a big time believer during that time period. Other people, like my best friend who's not much of a believer in things, thought there was some guy coming into her house to stab her or kill her or rape her. So when you're asleep, there's a lot of weird stuff that happens to your head. I mean, we know that there are some people that'll take Ambien and go drive a car somewhere or cook a meal in their kitchen while they're completely asleep. They are not even aware that they're doing these things that they're doing. So I think there was actually a court case where a guy did kill his wife in his sleep and did not remember doing it, and they actually proved that he does have this issue, you know? So is it a form of insanity, or is it just some kind of weird mental block? Is it a thing that has been suggested into you, or maybe is it just an excuse to be able to murder your wife and get away with it? I don't know.
We must ask Dr. Caligari. He's the only one that knows.
Or Dr. Ben, who's our resident. Yeah, I mean, I started bringing this back to the film. The way hypnosis is portrayed in this film, and there's no sort of definitive answer to how this film portrays hypnosis, rather, as opposed to something like Get Out, where it's clearly this magic plot device that they use to get the main character into brain surgery. But so I wonder about. It seems to me like when we're talking about hypnosis right now, we sort of are applying 21st century understanding of hypnosis, and I wonder what 1920s hypnosis would say, and then sort of contrasting that to the way it's portrayed in the film. It's almost as though we're meant to believe that Dr. Caligari does have hypnosis magic, who can, and he's capable of doing these weird things with it. I think in a more definitive reading of the ending, I guess I sort of turn that over to the rest of us and see and just ask, like, how is hypnosis portrayed in the film, and do we think that it is extra science outside of what we understand science to be now?
So before anyone answers that, I just want to point out, Jim, how awesome it is to think that the film that got ousted as on the Rotten Tomatoes 100 horror films of all time, right, was number one was Dr. Caligari till a few months ago, until Get Out, and both deal with like hypnosis, both deal with removal of a person's will. 100 years later, how wild is that to think about? That the number one and number two films sort of deal with the same sort of issue, maybe from a very different cultural or social perspective, but the same sort of like fundamental issue about hypnosis. That's really wild to think about.
Yeah, and I think it goes to sort of a fundamental fear of loss of control. We're afraid of losing our sanity, losing our control over who we are, doing shit that we don't like, killing our wives and waking up and going, "Oh shit, I did that." That kind of that's a far more primal fear than being afraid that Jason or Michael Myers is going to come stab us to death for a while. So.
Well, this is also a theme that comes up in a lot of amazing drama films that have to do with, people who are soldiers or in the FBI or work for the government, and there's like these soldiers that have been hypnotized. So when they hear a word, then they know to kill the politician. Or, we even see it in other genres where this is a completely frightening idea that this could happen in the world, where someone is killing others without truly knowing what they're doing.
The Manchurian Candidate effect, yeah.
Yeah, there's X-Files episodes like this. There's Fringe episodes like this. It's amazing to see sort of the evolution of this since Caligari. Yeah, I'm just going to throw this back to Ben, since he's clearly the triple PhD'd, MD'd. Yeah, I'm just going to build him up like he's shaking his head, but I don't know why you're shaking your head, Ben. You're clearly our guy for tonight.
You're the resident genius.
Yeah. Tell us all about the wonders of 1920s hypnotism, Ben. Clearly, you're up to the task.
Well, I mean, I sort of don't want to throw Ben under the bus like that, but I do sort of, like, did you, as a 21st century psychology graduate, think that hypnotism was portrayed in this film in a positive, negative, realistic, unrealistic light? Like, how did you think it was
It's a great
portrayed?
question. It's a great question.
Just to just contextualize all of this, I think this is the effect and the power of reading a book or several studies and talking about them and accidentally becoming an expert, even though you're totally not. Like, I'm going to easily and quickly hit the wall of my understanding of this process as well as its history. I will say that, I mean, by the time this film came out, right, so it had been developed and had been around in some form for about 100 years by then. But of course, 100 years after that, it's changed quite a bit in terms of its application and the theory and so on and so forth. But in terms of this film, I'm not sure that we actually see the process at any point, right? Like, so we don't actually see him conducting any sort of hypnotic technique. There's no methodology sort of outlined. We just know that there is this person who seems to be asleep, who is locked in what they're calling a cabinet, but is actually more like a coffin, really. And he supposedly is doing things under the control of Caligari, even though his only actions where he sort of like steps out and yes, the doll is in his place and he's out doing his shenanigans. Like, it seems to be almost as if he's just going out there. You don't actually see the instructions being given by Dr. Caligari. So it's really hard to pinpoint exactly what they're trying to portray there, except for the effect itself. And that might actually be to the film's credit, so that, many years down the road, we can't look at it and say, well, this is something that you can knock points off for because they got this part wrong. You really can't say that, because all you see is the result of whatever happened. You just have this guy going out there that is apparently asleep most of the time, but wakes up to do his master's bidding. That's all you really know.
They knew we were going to do this podcast, so they said, let's not talk about how it's actually done. Let's just hypnotize. It's done. There you go. Brilliance.
Yeah, they saw ahead, and then another 100 years from now, there will be another 4 people doing a podcast. It's like, oh, this is exactly how it's done. Yeah, I mean, in terms of sort of knocking points off the film, I think you're right, Ben. I think that not showing the hypnotism was a wise move because it also sets up the twists at the end. But I don't knock points off of Get Out because you can't hypnotize someone with a teacup. At least I'm pretty sure you can't hypnotize somebody with a teacup. Otherwise, I'll be more careful around teacups. But yeah, I guess this is sort of a weird cognitive dissonance. I don't knock points off of Get Out because of its unrealistic hypnotism, but I do knock points off of Now You See Me because of its unrealistic hypnotism. I don't know why.
Yeah, there's like you want to give it points for attempting to try to give you like that explanation, right? Like, you want it to be a good explanation, but if it's a shitty explanation, you're going to knock off like 10 points. But if there's no explanation, you're going to knock off like 2 points. You know what I mean? It's all about whether or not the movie is smarter than me, right? And I think that that's what Cabinet of Dr. Caligari does. The movie seems smarter than me because it got me twice. It gave me 2 twists that I didn't see coming, and good on you. Whereas, and Get Out, the hypnotism wasn't really a twist, so I don't really like. There wasn't a point there wasn't a point in limbo in Get Out, but there were points in limbo when it came to Now You See Me. Okay, how did you magicians do all this crazy shit? Oh, it was that? That's bullshit. Fuck you, movie. And so I think it's how the film structures the magic, the hypnotism in this case, how the film structures the magic, and whether or not that magic appears to be something that's pulling the rug out from under you, or something that's set up within the narrative fiction of the film from beginning to end. And this is set up in the narrative fiction of the film from beginning to end. We start at the beginning where Caligari's like, hey, I'm a
traveling circus person, and here's my crazy hypnotist guy, and blah 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 blah. Like that's, and so we accept those as the rules of the film, whereas in the other cases it's trying to use this magic as a twist. Does that make sense to everybody?
Oh, completely. We call that the Garrett threshold. Really, this is how you decided it? That's literally, we call it the Garrett threshold.
That is the Garrett threshold. I think it sort of comes from my many conversations with Garrett about movies, but and I think that his line, I think that the thing that I said earlier, like if the movie gets me, then I think that is something Garrett has said as part of his aesthetic criteria to movies many times.
And it's a big one. It's a big one. He's going to be doing a lecture in a couple of weeks on the philosophy of horror for us, and his concept of fear is connected to that. Like a film is scary to Garrett if it's something he didn't think of. That the ending or just the nature of the film is one where he couldn't do it better. That is fear to him. It's a little different for Antonio. It's a little different for me. It's a little different for Shayra and Ben. But for Garrett, it's specifically the idea of like, whoa, I did not think it. Like, that's how you're going to end. Wow. That's the nature of fear to Garrett. So anyway, I call it the Garrett threshold. Anyway, he's probably going to crucify me if he sees this, but whatever. I feel like that's accurate.
Well, I think with scary movies, it's really, really great to have a twist at the end of a scary movie. I think that's the fun aha moment, usually like the unmasking of the monster and like, oh, it was you, and Scooby-Doo. I guess they really utilize that a lot. But to have a twist at the end, it's always fun. But for me, even when I predict a movie, if it was able to take me on an exciting enough journey, I don't care if I predicted it, as long as they did it like the way I would have done it, I guess. And I know it's really egotistical, but
no, that's the opposite of Garrett, right? So that's great. It's the idea that it took you down I hope it goes this way, right? Like, I hope it does this. That's a really cool appeal. And I think you're onto something, actually, Shara, because this is one of those movies that I think the appeal, a lot of it for me was like the detective story element of it, not so much the horror story element, but the like, what's really going on? Like you sort of play the role as the detective in this film. It's one of the earliest versions of that, and I totally dug that. It's also one of the first movies where there's like a story within a story, so you have to go back a step and go, wait a minute, like what's really going on? You're trying to follow the clues, as it were, which I thought was unique and awesome.
Now I know what we need to do. If this is a horror murder mystery, we have to have a Dr. Caligari themed murder mystery party with all of us now. That would just be so much fun.
Oh my word. That would be amazing. At the Shining Hotel. Yeah.
Are we going to delve into the historical stuff in Germany and Hitler and all that fun stuff? Are we going to go to those places with this review or no?
Let's.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, there is a book, right? Caligari to Hitler. It's a famous book that talks about some of this stuff. Goes into like Nosferatu and other shit. There's
also a documentary on Netflix that everybody can go watch if they want that goes into it. Obviously, it's in German. You gotta read some. But it's really fascinating stuff. I guess my 2 cents into it is this. If you look through a lot of the films that were coming out during this time in Germany, you got a lot of these creepy older men that are, trying to take control and power of things. There's a lot of obsessing over who's in control and who's in power, and they're very much prophetic as to what was going to happen with Hitler. But interestingly enough, a lot of these films that came out, which I watched Mabuse, I believe it's like Dr. Mabuse, I watched I watched a whole bunch of these random movies from my book that I'm reading right now. I watch all these movies and I'm like, this all seems very much the same themes happening over and over and over and over again. And I think they were very prophetic as knowing there was going to be a tyrant that was going to come about during that time. And Hitler must have just gone to the movies and he was like, you know what? And he's obsessed with filmmaking. I mean, that was a huge part of his propaganda that he put forth, was having a lot of movie makers and filmmakers work for him to perpetuate his ideas. So I think he was a movie buff, so that's interesting that he was into that art form that much and maybe got ideas from it, and in a way their prophecy became true because of a movie buff. I don't know. Maybe I'm just speculating too much, blaming movies for Hitler, but it seems like something to definitely consider, what your ideas that come out in art how they might affect the future.
Well, what is it that they say, that life imitates art and art imitates life, right? I think there's definitely some merit to that idea. What'd you say this documentary is called? I'm really gonna have to go see that now.
It's from Caligari to Hitler, and they go into all the different films during that era. They do all tend to have very similar type of themes, and I would also suggest the movies that they talk about. Check them out; they're all excellent. Metropolis is really good. M is really good. Obviously, it'll take some time to get through all the films, but I definitely was seeing a theme of the things that people were afraid of during that time period, just based off of the movies they were making.
Yeah, it reminds me of the old Ricky Gervais joke where Hitler's he in the voice of Hitler, he's like, "Oh yeah, I read your book, Nietzsche, about killing all the Jews. I never wrote that." Well, I read between the lines. But yeah, there's I don't know. I think that I think films sort of represent what we as a culture are going through, and I you know I wouldn't draw a line from we made movies about tyrants to then a tyrant came about, but I would rather say that in the 1920s, Germany was afraid of a tyrant, and then a tyrant came about. It seems to be. I guess I'm saying that the connection is a little bit more tenuous than I guess the thesis of this documentary is. But then again, I haven't seen the documentary, so I don't.
There's way more to it. Don't take my word for it. But
yeah. To be fair, Jim, my understanding is that the author traces the conceptions of power in early German expressionist philosophy and also art and film and cinema to Hitler, essentially. That it's kind of like the diffusion of social angst and social issues that sort of lead up to an authoritarian figure, that you see it in cinema leading up to Hitler. And you're right in the sense that, well, that doesn't necessarily mean that Hitler was sort of an essential piece, an essential part of German culture at the time, but it certainly is interesting to sort of pursue. There's been a lot of critique, like you say, but backlash is probably too strong of a word, but from my understanding, there's been kind of well, can we really draw those comparisons culturally, socially in post-World War I Germany? But there certainly is a kind of push towards a kind of authoritarian figure, a kind of Superman. I hate to say a kind of Ubermensch. I hate to do that because I'm a super Nietzschean. But yeah, it's a really interesting thesis. One in which I don't think I'm too. I just don't know enough to really pursue here. I wish I would. But it's interesting to think about the fact that apparently a lot of early German expressionist film sort of hinted at this sort of thing in a very obvious way. So it's really interesting. I mean, we have this, the other thing I want to point out is we have this like Monday morning quarterback appeal where everything is always like, well, Hitler would have well, that reminds me of Hitler. Well, Hitler also did this, like we have that sort of thing because I think for a long period of time, people trace sort of the genealogy of power in early Germany to the rise of Hitler, sort of post-Weimar sort of understanding of things, to be like, well, this is how Hitler rose. And it's become so banal over time that people like you and I go, oh, like we've heard that a million times. And the connections aren't really there. But for early, for people who had to escape Hitler Germany, a Nazi Germany, the connections were heavily there. I mean, some of these are early. Some of these conversations about Caligari and Hitler are early, not just 80s, 90s, 2000s, but back when Hitler was around, which is really interesting. So there's something there. I don't know if it's our cultural psyche and how it sort of connects to power and authoritarianism, but there's something there that I think is interesting and worth exploring. I just don't think I'm up to the task of doing it.
Well, let me throw this one out here that's really important, at least with the particular film we're reviewing right now. With Caligari, there was a lot of people that were very much against what Hitler did and that were part of making this film that were kind of trying to be like, hey, guys, let's not go down this path. And they saw Hitler fuck this shit. And there was a lot of filmmakers during that time that had to escape because they would not fall in line with Hitler's propaganda. But what's interesting is the guy who plays Dr. Caligari, the director, he really is a legitimate Nazi sympathizer, anti-Semite who worked alongside with the fucking Nazi party. So this isn't just some, you're Hitler because I disagree with you, and you're Hitler because I disagree with you. Like, there are legit people in this film that were linked up with Nazi propaganda and the movement to eradicate all Jews. So Dr. Caligari is truly evil in real life, too. The actor who played it is pure fucking evil in my viewpoint. So
yeah, fuck you, dude.
so I think that adds an element for me when I watch the movie now, though, is I look at it and I'm like, he really is a fucking slimy, evil little fuck. But there's also elements that that I noticed that kind of hint at why people were hating on Jews, and it like added some of that anti-Semite shit to the storyline. Like if you look at how certain people were portrayed that were in places of power, a lot of them looked like they were Jewish people. They were in higher power, and people were upset about it. So I don't know. There might be some anti-Semitism even kind of laced into the film somewhat, without people actually trying to put it there, that people read into more so, as you said with the Gervais thing, where it's like I could read between the lines. I mean, it could have been people that saw this, town clerk on this giant chair, and they're like, "That's a freaking Jew." Who knows how their mindset was when they were watching the film and how they interpreted it. So it's a complicated issue on how people interpret the media that they absorb.
I was originally going to give this film a really high score. I don't know if I can do that now, Shara. You might have just destroyed it for me.
I honestly do not think the filmmaker, I think it was the exact opposite what they were trying to portray. They were trying to be like, don't let a Hitler happen. But sometimes when you say no to something, it can be interpreted the other way. Like, oh, this is what we need to do then. I don't know. It's interpretation, right? It's art.
Yeah, Lindsay Ellis has a great video about how she's talking about how Nazis are portrayed in satire. She's defending Mel Brooks's the producers and the Nazi party, how Nazis are portrayed, on and on and on. And she says that some of the Nazi iconography of American History X, which is clearly an anti-Nazi film, has then been appropriated by Nazis, because not only does, American History X makes Nazis look bad, but they also kind of look badass in Lindsay Ellis's view. And I think she's right. I think she's got a fine point there. Maybe we can link her video in the description later on. But the point, I think that I certainly see what you're talking about with M and with Metropolis, but with Caligari, I'm sort of having some cognitive dissonance between drawing the line between what's portrayed in this film to Nazism and all that other shit. And so I mean, maybe I just don't look at, I didn't look at the film through the lens of could this be Nazi propaganda too?
Well, Nazis weren't around then. This was World War I. But, so this is like building up to a situation, but it is an absolute fact that this film was an analogy about the powers that be and the people that are in charge over in Germany at that time period. So it is a very political film, whether, people want to interpret it that way or not. But whether it's Nazi propaganda, I don't know about that. But I could definitely see how some people might watch it and be like, oh, this is totally backing up my viewpoint on this, that, and the other. But it's all interpretation, right?
Okay, I see yeah, and I didn't mean to suggest that it was Nazi propaganda in 1920. I apologize if I meant that.
Proto-Nazis. Proto-Nazis. Thanks,
clearly.
Jim. Thanks.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I thought that Shakespeare was about Nazis too. No,
I'm the only other guy with a shaved head. You had to go there. You just had to go there. Really.
No, I guess what I meant was, I see how the film's political, and I see how it's how that politics can sort of translate to tyrannical, authoritarian government. I see all of that. I just never made those connections until you just did now, and so it's taken me a little bit before I'm like, Oh yeah, that's right. But
It's
and so
really uncomfortable too, though, I have to say.
it is. Yeah, I like the. I guess I'm with Ben. You know, I kind of like this film, and now I see that there might be some anti-Semitism in it.
Damn
Fuck.
it! We should have like rated this film the first 30 minutes. God damn it! God damn it! Yeah, I mean, when you think about the sort of authoritarianism and the capacity to be taken advantage of, we think of Cesare and we think of, you know, sort of sleepwalking and post World War I Germany, and you're open, you're susceptible to being taken advantage of. Hint, 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 hint. I mean, there's something there, I think. And so I think that's where this sort of origin from Caligari to Hitler sort of finds itself.
Yeah, I think somewhere they said that, you know, Caligari would represent the government, obviously the town clerk and all these other people with the high hats, or, you know, the corporations and the people that are kind of running things with their money. And then, you know, you have a sleepwalker who's essentially the soldiers, and how they're, you know, you just tell them to go do what you need them to do and kill when you tell them to kill. So there's a lot of interesting analogies that have come from this film and how people have interpreted it. I like to look at it as a horror film, personally. I like to look at the artistry of it and look at the backgrounds and stuff like that. But I understand that it was meant to be a political analogy, and I understand that it's important to look at it that way. But it's an uncomfortable thing for me to do, too. And I was reading some stuff right before the show, and I was like, I'm gonna have to look into this more. I don't think I'm gonna mention some of this stuff on the show. So maybe this is something we could actually discuss at another time, too. Or maybe when we watch Metropolis, you know, we could go into this more, because that definitely would land in this topic again.
Nope, it's all about Hitler. 1 out of 10. I'm scoring it for everybody across the board. 1 out of 10. Thanks, Hitler. Thanks.
Right, Hitler ruined a good horror film. Yeah, I mean, I guess to sort of go off of your point, Shayra, like, for me, I think it's possible for something to be both morally abhorrent and also rather well done. Like, it's possible for something to be. I don't think that we can say that clearly it's not Nazi propaganda, because it precedes Nazis by a good period of time, over a decade. But like, as a horror film that has a great deal of artistry, the film is to be commended. As a film that is warning against authoritarian politics, it's to be commended. As a film that is anti-Semitic, it is to not be commended. It is to be, of course, we'll shit on the film altogether. But for me, I think it's possible for a film to be both abhorrent in some moral terms, but also that there is a degree of artistry to it. And I don't know
Absolutely.
if that's a cognitive dissonance, like if that's a separation that I shouldn't be doing. Like, should I to sort of transfer this to a more modern example, something that people can all sort of latch onto? You know, I'm a huge Woody Allen fan. But then again, there's an ad hominem attack that makes me feel creepy about liking his work. So I guess that's sort of a thing that we can all talk about as we're sort of exploring our aesthetic criteria approaching film.
I think that's a legitimate topic that we should possibly just talk about the morals of liking certain things, because that's interesting in and of itself. With some of the horror movies that people like Serbian film, I know that usually drums up a lot of people going, why would anyone like this movie? This is absolute garbage. It's horrible. It's evil. You're immoral if you like it. But are you, for watching something, are you immoral? Or are you bad? Or, you know, in hindsight, when you find out some of the stuff behind it, I mean, when I'd known about Woody Allen and his stuff when I watched a Woody Allen movie, I think it was Manhattan, where he's like with an underage girl, and he's like knowingly with an underage girl, talking about how it's a completely wrong thing, and not only that, illegal. He's like, fine with it in the movie, and I'm like, is anyone else super creeped out by this? And they're like, you know, it's Woody Allen, like, it's your grandpa, like, it's okay. He's an old man, let him be this way. But it's like, it's really cringy, and it makes me really uncomfortable. But I liked the movie, even though that part creeped me out. So what does that say about me, you know?
God, you guys are such perverts.
I know, right?
I mean,
God.
Manhattan, the ending climactic scene, the great run, that tracking shot that's the most famous shot, is him running to an underage girl to convince her to be in a sexual relationship with him. And that's why Manhattan is the top of most people's Woody Allen list, but it's not at the top of mine, because that is legitimately creepy. You know, in the not even just understanding what's going on with Woody Allen in his personal, although this is way before his relationship with Sun Yi. Manhattan predates all of that. Nonetheless, within the context of that film, that's creepy. And I think that's where I have problems. Like, I have problems with Manhattan. I have problems with Birth of a Nation within the context of that film. That's outwardly racist. I have problems with there's another Woody Allen film where it's Husbands and Wives. There's a section where he's like, I'm tempted to fuck this underage student, but I'm not going to because I'm morally, like, I recognize the moral problems with it.
True morality right there.
Yeah.
True morality. Yeah.
Oh, I know how we could fix this. We could just start doing a rating system of like how much we thought it was beautiful artistry to the film, and then how just completely abhorrent it actually is in real life. No, I'm just joking.
Well, it's like Crimes and Misdemeanors. I'm right there with you, Jim. Like, Crimes and Misdemeanors is one of my favorite films, and I have like weird like feelings about Woody Allen and all the personal shit and stuff. So I totally get that. Yeah, I mean, so maybe we could cut it this way. Maybe the distortion of reality is somewhere in these films in which they lead up to Hitler, right? Like maybe there's some distortion of reality in Caligari that connects to the ideal of Hitler coming to power, and you know, maybe we could explore that. But yeah, I totally get that. I totally get that. There is kind of a, like, the person behind the film, the director behind the film, the intent behind the film, and the film itself. That gets us into a very complex discussion, but it's one in which I'm very sympathetic and I completely understand. I would hate to be the one that says, oh God, a Serbian film, like, it's up there with Schindler's List. You know, I'd hate to be that guy. No, I'm not going to say that. Not going to say that. I hate to be that guy, but I can see the appeal, right? I can see the appeal if you really thought that, you know, if you see the distinction between the artist and the art, you know, I don't know.
And I do try and see a distinction between the artist and the art. And I also, we should probably note for the record that that Woody Allen has not been tried or convicted in a court of law.
No, he's a perv. It's science. Like, it's scientifically demonstrated that he's a perv. But that's just me. That's just me saying.
But yeah, it's
the
not
court
just
of public opinion.
It's not just the person who created it and, you know, what the art is, but also the interpretations that come from it too, and how we interpret and move with that art. Like, it's really interesting to see what comes of it. And this is where we have those huge discussions where, like, does watching a movie cause someone to kill somebody, or does watching a movie cause violence or rape or whatever? I mean, that's when those interesting debates happen. And even though it's really a touchy topic, it's still fascinating as all holy hell. I've read multiple books on different perspectives on that topic, and it's very fascinating. So,
which is so perfect, because in this film, the idea of, like, so do you remember the scene in this film where Cesare is about to kill Jean, and they don't show it, but they show him doing this, and he stops, and there's and in the scene where he actually kills somebody, it's a shadow, right? Like, that's the thing. It was one of the first indicators of, let's not really show this, let's show the shadow of it. Let's show the representation of it. Even early on in early cinema, they couldn't do the, God, I hate to throw this in there, but like the Saw-esque, like a nasty, we're gonna show the stab going through, or who is it? It was it Garrett or someone else in this podcast had mentioned that the most horrific death scene was like in Saving Private Ryan, where the knife slowly goes through the fellow's chest, really slow, and the guy's like, no, stop, and the knife just slowly goes all the way through. I forget who it was. That's sort of the opposite in Caligari. Caligari is the shadow. It's, you're not going to see it. You're going to see the representation of it. And that was
very Alfred Hitchcock, honestly.
Yes.
And honestly, that is so well fits into what the theme of this movie is, because we have a hypnosis over this guy. He's seeing things from this particular perspective because of someone messing with his mind. And in a way, when you're watching that movie, someone's messing with your mind, because nobody's actually getting killed, but in your mind, somebody's getting killed. They've manipulated your mind to know that somebody's getting killed. And so that's what's so awesome, is it's talking about messing with your mind while messing with your mind. And it's very beautiful. It's meta in a way.
Oh my God. No, you're so right. Because when we think of Francis, Francis is the one telling us the story, right? And so we become, like, quote unquote, hypnotized through the story, through the narration of Francis. And at the end, the film shows us that we've been tricked, if you will, right? Francis is an inmate in an insane asylum, right? So there's some social commentary there too. There's some interesting things we could explore there, that we're the ones being hypnotized when we think of the fact that we're being told a story by someone in an insane asylum. I can think of current films like Identity and other films in which that's given, that just don't even come close to Caligari, you know. Very interesting.
And so the political, I do kind of want to go back to this idea that the politics of the film are connected to tyrannical regimes. And so the idea is that we've been tricked by an insane person to believing all of this stuff is true, and then at the end the rug is pulled out from under us, and there is another possibly nefarious person in the person of Dr. Caligari, who is actually pulling all the strings. Is that sort of the political interpretation of the film? Because I feel like that in our last sort of conversation, we took it for granted that this was a film that's promoting tyrannical regimes, and I don't know that it is, right?
No.
Right, I did want to ask that question.
No, it's not. I don't think it's actually promoting. I think it's actually trying to make it look bad.
It's the opposite. Yes.
That's what I thought. I just wanted to make sure we were clear on that point before we moved on. I'm sorry, Ben, go ahead.
Oh no, I was going to say, yeah, just agreeing with everyone. Obviously, yes, I did kind of want to ask that question, because what it seems like to me is that, you know, yes, we're hearing this, what could potentially be interpreted as a warning from what we in the end believe is a crazy person. And so, you know, I mean, maybe that says something about the messenger, right? Like, you know, we're going to get this warning. You know, we're all going to be like, well, no, obviously this person's insane. How could that ever happen? But at the very end, it kind of leaves you wondering, well, maybe there is a little bit of truth to it. And that's sort of the way I kind of interpreted that.
That's what happened with Body Snatchers too, where you had this madman coming in and he's like, they're recreating us in these pods and blah, blah, blah. And they're freaking out and stuff. And they're like, okay, this guy needs help. But maybe Francis isn't all that crazy. He might be in a psych ward, but maybe he is a legitimate person who's telling a legitimate story. Who knows? But it is distorted, so it's pretty obvious he's got a crazy lens when he's telling the story. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of want to agree. I think that the sense of artificiality in this movie lends us to think that there's a question mark under the authoritarianism, that you never, like, fuck, I don't want to put this, like, no one really has the truth with a capital T, that there really is a distortion here, that there's a real kind of early subjectivism in this film. Do I want to say that? Yeah, I mean, kind of, right? Like, there's a distorted reality. There's kind of a reality of a madman here that's being expressed. And I think that goes into maybe undermining a kind of authoritarianism, and in that sense that, you know, it makes this film a kind of anti-authoritarianistic film. I don't know.
As we were talking, I started to wonder if this is like early postmodern, like the first postmodern film. And there's certainly some elements to recommend it in that sense, right?
Oh my God, can you imagine, like, evangelicals grasping onto this? This would be the earliest postmodern film ever. It's very interesting you said that, Jim, because I sort of felt the same way when I was thinking about this, kind of like the radical story within a story, subjectivist interpretation. Is he crazy? Is he not crazy? What's real? What's not real? Those questions 100 years ago being the sort of stepping stones to a kind of postmodern interpretation of very impressionistic film and impressionistic art. Like, that's a really good question. Is it? I mean, fuck, I feel like I need more of a historical background to be able to give you an answer to that. But I kind of want to ask that question too. 100 years ago, were we asking the same sorts of questions that we're asking now? So long story short, like, I don't actually feel like we're in a postmodern society. It's one of the things that maybe I hate to say this, that I actually agree with modern, very religious, very Christian, very evangelical people about, is that we're not really in a postmodern society. Even now, we have we still have frames of reference. Like, to have this conversation even between us, we still have frames of reference in which we can agree, disagree, in which we can navigate interpretations. But a true postmodern society is one in which to borrow a very Nietzschean phrase, there is no up or down. There is no mode of interpretation. When that ever happens, then we've hit a true postmodern society. But I think this may be the first instantiation of asking fundamental questions that get us to a postmodern society. I hope that makes sense.
I've actually got to kind of disagree with you, because in our politics, at least, I think that we have entered postmodernism. Like, there is no objective truth, whatever the president, I made the phone calls, I made all the calls, and of course, he didn't. So like I've called Donald Trump the first postmodern president, and I think many of us on the left are trying to hold him account based upon rules of etiquette and rules of truth that are not that he doesn't apply to, or that he doesn't agree with.
So long as there are people that try to hold President Trump under rules of interpretation in which there are truths and falsities, we're not under a postmodern interpretation of the world. So long as there are people that still value such a thing, that would, to me, undermine the idea that we're in a postmodern society. I guess that's maybe where I'm at.
That makes a lot of sense.
The way that I would approach that too is that if we're talking about this as being the first postmodern president, I guess it would be indicative of a future trend, and we'd really have to see how things change over time from now on. Is this a presidency that defines presidencies moving forward for the rest of our arc of history? And I do call it an arc, because if this is the trend, then it clearly isn't heading in a positive direction. But you do see more celebrities leaning themselves into politics. You do see kind of the showmanship overshadowing the facts and the truth of the matter, and for God's sake, the policy, the shit that really matters. Clearly that seems to play second fiddle to whatever grand show that you can put on with your tweets and with the contention and the sport of the back and forth between right and left. That really does seem to dominate the entire discussion. And that is, I would almost call that a real fear of mine. Like, that's, outside of film, I have the kind of horror films that I really sort of gravitate to. But when it comes to reality, I guess the fears are a little bit different. And this is truly a fear that I think I have when it comes to reality. So I might agree with Jim, but I would be really interested in seeing where this goes from now, and hopeful that he's wrong. I hope you're wrong, Jim. I really hope so.
I hope I am too. Obviously, I hope I'm wrong. But and then to sort of bring this back to the film and our discussions about German politics, circa 1920 to 1940s, 1930s and 40s, if there was a Deadly Analysis podcast in 1941, would they be like, well, this is the first postmodern, Führer?
We'd all have been hung. That's what we've all been hung. All of us. We've been hung.
Well, yeah, definitely. But imagine if we were still able to talk before we were hung. Would we be arguing the same type of things? Because clearly Hitler's propaganda was all lies and distortions and bullshit, and atop more bullshit. And I sort of wonder about how, revisiting Caligari in a 2017 lens, and how reality and fact and interpretation are distorted in this film. Does it have applications to our political environment? And it seems that it does. I mean, I think that the move into this discussion has been organic, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Fuck. Thanks, Trump. Thank you. for, thank you for doing this for our podcast.
Can I go to a dark place for all of you?
I thought we already were, but sure.
We're definitely in the dark. I mean, look at Noah's camera.
Yeah.
Twist number one, guys. Here goes.
My viewpoint on this is we're doing the same old, same old. I mean, we've always put celebrities and people as figureheads in power. They've never really mattered. They've always just been there to look a certain way and be a certain way so that we could say things are a certain way. They're inconsequential, but also super powerful, and it's a scary fucking thing that's always existed in human history, and it's just, we're still there, and I think this is just going to be lumped in with another huge chunk of hundreds of history of humanity where they're going to be like, this was the barbaric time when they were really dumb, and that's just, I think that's how everybody's going to perceive this time period. I'd like to try to say something more poignant, but that's my dark perspective on this time period.
No, I totally think that what you said has made me, for the first time in my life, happy about the idea of a banality. Like, happy about the idea that this is not the first time that this has happened. That is, Shayra, truly an amazing
my darkness
experience.
made you happy?
It really did. The idea that this is not unique, and this is the banality of, like, the human endeavors and the American endeavor is amazing to think of. It makes me feel really good about our future.
I mean, just look at any leader from any country at any time period throughout human history. I'll say, like, within the last 1,000 years. And you look at all these figureheads, and obviously they have power to do things, but they've always been pretty much unable to solve the world's problems or be able to take over the entire world like Hitler was trying to do. They've never really been able to do the thing they've been trying to do. They're temporary. It's not as big of an effect as we might think. Now, there might be a pattern that results from Trump. There might be a pattern that results from all different kinds of things, but that's to be seen. And honestly, this was predicted in Idiocracy that dumb celebrities were gonna start taking over, and nobody was like, that's impossible. They were like, yep, that's our future. I know it's happening. And so when Trump came in, I was like, Idiocracy already predicted this. I was already prepared mentally.
I just want to enjoy this moment before Jim and Ben, who are clearly ready to say something. Like, I just want to enjoy it before they say anything right now. Let me hold on. Okay, I got it. Yeah, I'm done. Go ahead, guys.
I'll just share a brief conversation that I had with a friend of mine during the 2012 election. And they were afraid that Romney was going to win, how much would all of us kill for Romney right now? That bad phrase. Anyway, how much all of us would pine for Romney right now. But I said, if he wins, it's not a big deal. We've been through this before. We survived Bush. It was fine. And then we moved to Obama. It was okay. We survived it. Historical perspective. And he looked at me and he said, yeah, but some of us didn't. And that's how, when I start to think about the age of Trump, I agree with Shayra. We will survive. This is sort of cyclical human history. We'll be fine. But then I do think about, yeah, but some of us didn't. And
Spanish flu.
But
Boom.
Some of us didn't.
Right.
Yeah.
We'll figure it out. And it does suck that there's always going to be a loss. There's always going to be a loss, and it sucks. But life sucks, and then you die. The end.
Well,
welcome to the Deadly Analysis Podcast, the most optimistic place for you to engage in these philosophical issues.
I'm not saying you shouldn't care, though, by the way.
Right.
Feel free to care all you want, obviously.
The retort that I think I would have to this, though, if I can just throw that in there, is that, obviously these blips, just like the little outlier, hopefully, the optimistic approach here is to thinking that this leader, or any leader really, that leans toward the postmodern and tries to throw away truth or distort the grand kind of narrative, or, maybe just suggest that, whatever is being said that factual really doesn't matter. Maybe that's an outlier. Maybe that just sort of happens every now and again and people are kind of attracted to it, but then it goes away and we get on with our business. The things that are a little more terrifying are going to be the slow trends that are a lot harder to pick up on, because people tend to have very short memories and very short attention spans. And you've got to really look at the long game and the slow trends to kind of figure out what the direction actually is here. And so when I'm looking at kind of the political situation now, what I kind of like hearken back to is thinking about the discussions between Bush Sr. and Reagan and how those debates go. and how they're talking about maybe like, immigration and the approach that they take of inclusion and of actually having kind of like a fairly cohesive position between them. But, there are clear differences, but they're having like a rational discourse. And that just seems to be entirely gone now, just in the course of, I don't necessarily know if that was just a particular period in history. Like that's about as far back as my memory goes. But when you look at something like this, okay, so let's take Caligari, and we take some of these other silent films that we've talked about, or like some of these other masterpieces of horror and of fear. And if we take our sort of like larger thesis, I think that we've seen in this podcast, that horror is a mirror, and you look at yourself through horror to figure out what your fears are. They're educational. They tell you something about yourself. If that's true, and maybe the larger trend of horror films is going towards shit like Saw 5 or 6 or whatever, what does that tell you? The lack of complexity in the storytelling, the lack of depth in the fears, the superficiality and shallowness displayed in these films. If you move from something like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari in the 20s to Saw 6 in 2017 or whatever, what does that tell you about the overall trend?
Yeah, we become Chesarari. That's all right, Ben. Well, I'm going to end this podcast by hanging myself. So thank you. That was great. That's great.
Don't do that yet. We need you in 2 weeks.
But see how much this movie, like, it could totally be related to stuff that's going on today. It's not that it even aged bad, because even though it's pretty obvious it's an older film, like, it easily has concepts that we can relate to, and it doesn't push it so much that you're like, oh, this is obviously talking about this particular thing. Like, you can relate it to the things that are going on now. We could probably go into political discussion for 8 hours straight just based off of this film alone, which is awesome and so telling about the layers that are behind it. So I think that's cool, honestly.
Yeah, no, I'm actually renaming this session from Trump to Caligari. That's going to be the next, like, that's how I'm naming this on YouTube. So be looking for it.
Caligari to Trump.
Yeah.
Or because time doesn't mean anything anymore from Trump to Caligari. Right. I don't know. I sort of want to pick up on Ben's point about how we've gone from Caligari to Saw 25. I guess I want to challenge that and ask, is that a one-to-one comparison? Are the things that Caligari is trying to do similar to the things that Saw is trying to do? And I don't think so. We had stupid monster movies in the 20s and 30s and 40s. And we have stupid monster movies today. I guess I'm trying to think of a modern horror film that is similar to Caligari. And, Get Out comes to mind. Shutter Island comes to mind. Those are other films that are trying to pull the rug out from under us. But, Get Out has so much. So I really don't know if there's a one-to-one comparison there. And that's why I sort of struggle with the idea of a sort of downward spiral in our artistic sensibilities, because I don't think that we're there. I think there's always been shit, and there's always been really good art, and people in horror movie podcasts 100 years from now will be talking about the good shit. They won't be talking about Jigsaw. At least that's maybe I'm being optimistic. I'm catching some of Noah's optimism. It's horrible.
Wow, this is a really interesting segue, because when we think of Saw 25, which there might actually be a Saw 25, what we're really saying is let's think about the banality of horror films. Think about the continuation of and the perpetuation of films in which there's an issue that makes money, but there really is no depth or something, compared to an issue that may have some cultural or social significance. And let's compare those two. And I think, I don't know, man, like, how do I want to put this? Like, the idea that there would be a Saw 25 is kind of, it dances around the idea that there would be something original, like the Doctor of Caligari. Like, those two things are sort of, there's a challenge in Saw 25 that presents itself to give us a Caligari. That sounds unbelievably stupidly, way more poetic than I mean it to be. But the idea that there would be this banality and sort of our social critiques, or maybe our, just to say artistically, our horror films, we're kind of asking for a Caligari in a certain sense. So those, I think, are more connected than I think we give them credit to. I don't know.
Would Get Out be the modern Caligari? I mean, I hate to keep proffering this film as a
It's
one-to-one
certainly a
comparison.
rebirth, right? It's certainly a rebirth of it. I mean, the more that it was brought, so I used to really get upset at the idea that, like, on Rotten Tomatoes, and this is very ironic in a lot of ways, the idea that, like, on Rotten Tomatoes top 100 horror films of all time, that Caligari was #1 up until Get Out, and then it became #2, and Get Out became #1. That used to anger me, only in the sense that this is a modern horror film that trumped. God, I hate to use that word. I'm never going to use the word trumped again after this conversation. That beat, an older horror film 100 years ago that had the same sort of appeal, which is ironic in, like, multiple layers, because I started this podcast with the idea that, like, modern horror films should be valued in a way that are higher than older ones. Fuck you, Noah, for having this conversation, because here I am defending Caligari. But yeah, I mean, I think it is a kind of modern. I can't believe I'm about to say this, actually. Like, it kind of is a modern Caligari in the sense that it takes modern, more more tangible social issues in regards to race relations that exist in the West, and plants them in the same sort of social categories as the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. It may actually be 100-year, I don't want to say reversal, but 100-year sort of level up, a sort of 100-year, this is where we're at now, of a Caligari film, which is really wild for me to think about. I'm actually kind of angry that we had this podcast, because I thought there was this, like, real depth to Caligari that was in and of itself its own thing, but it may, in a Trumpian sort of way, maybe a reinstantiation of a film 100 years ago that was done, which is really wild to think about.
Well, I mean, both of them are really fantastic films. Caligari is fantastic in its own measure, and I really liked Get Out. I hope we're not hating on Get Out too much on the podcast.
Not at all. Not at all.
It's we talked before the podcast about how the critic score of Dr. Caligari still keeps it as #1 as a horror film. But the Rotten Tomatoes recommend or not recommend Get Out has jumped over Dr. Caligari. I think that as I'm playing with this idea about Get Out being a modern Caligari, it's making more and more sense as time goes on. And whereas you seem to have some sort of cognitive dissonance, you're not happy about that, I'm perfectly okay with that. I'm perfectly okay with Get Out being in the same conversation as Caligari, because both of them are fine films and both of them are doing interesting, thoughtful social critiques that people need to hear. And I think people need to hear.
Basically, don't. See, I've seen other films try to pull this off too, and they didn't do it right though, like Stir of Echoes. But basically, don't let people, like, manipulate you. And I mean, this is always going to be a problem humans are going to face. So that's always going to be a perfect, not just horror element, but a drama element. There's a lot of dramas that go into this in many different ways and many different aspects. And even in romance movies where there's a trouble between a couple, they have problems with someone having control over them, the master and the slave kind of interaction. So it's always going to be something that's interesting. But when you can really scare the shit out of somebody with that storyline, it's going to hit something, because anyone is capable of being manipulated in this way. So that's so awesome. Also, I have to say, Jim, Caligari, that is the most amazing word you just accidentally invented.
Caligari. I was going to say, perfect. It's a new word. Caligari.
All right. That's my greatest contribution to the English language. Thank you.
Anyone else have one? I don't know how to add something out of this. This has been a very very in-depth conversation. Man, I'm gonna, like, just this conversation. I'm on the fly sort of realizing that this movie and the social critique that it offers is a lot higher than I initially had recognized in a kind of Trumpian era. God, I can't wait till, like, 2022 when we just don't use that word anymore. But in any event, like, I realized that this has more applicability in it 100 years later than I had originally recognized. And and I've said this before in earlier, like probably countless earlier iterations of this podcast, where I've said that part of the reason I started this podcast was to raise up modern horror films, good modern horror films, as having, like, to talk about those more than I would talk about horror films that are nostalgic and that have been there since times past, that are well known. But the more I think about it, man, films like Phantom Carriage and like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari have something that are timeless to them, that even now, like, sort of resonate with all of us in 2017. And there's a sense in which that's awe-inspiring, but it's also frustrating, because I don't want to say that. I want to talk about like Cabin in the Woods, and I want to talk about It Follows as being unique. But the truth is, some of these films just speak to something so fundamental that 100 years later, we can still see it as applicable. And then I think in and of itself is worth seeing some of these films as being unbelievably, like just 10 out of 10s, unbelievably miraculous and fantastic 100 years later. And I don't want to say it like beats some of the modern horror films, but I almost feel like we'd have to exist 100 years in the future to even be able to compare them. And that's kind of frustrating to me. I don't know. I feel like these conversations in the last couple months have made me take a step back and say, maybe these films that we discuss, like Caligari, like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, even, which is a little more recent, maybe these are so absolutely highly rated and fantastic because they speak to a kind of fundamentality that exists even in modern horror films, but do them better. And that's frustrating to me, because part of this project was to set out to be like, okay, let's think of films in the last 20 years that do those things that have been done 100 years earlier or within the last 100 years, but do them like almost up to par, or do them better even. And the more the farther back we go, and we think of like The Seventh Seal, or when we think of films like this, The Phantom Carriage, or The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, there's a sense in which there's a fundamentality that persists even into 2017. And we'd have to exist 100 years from now to be able to compare those two to films that we've talked about, even a few months ago. So I'm kind of frustrated at all of you. God damn you.
But no, I mean, I think you just hit a home run and you didn't realize it, like that scene in Moneyball. I think you hit a home run and you don't realize it, because we spend probably more than I wish talking about modern issues and talking about Get Out. And if we think about it, Get Out is a film that does what Dr. Caligari does, but it does it with racial politics, which, from Shayra's addition to this conversation, it seems like the racial politics of Dr. Caligari are problematic, anti-Semitic. The racial politics in Get Out are not problematic. So if anything, what we've seen in our discussion here is that a modern horror film has done what Caligari has done, but has done it better. So it has successfully, to borrow the cliche, stood on the shoulders of genius to reach higher. And so I think in a way, we, the four of us, have celebrated a modern horror film through the context of an older horror film. And there's nothing to be disappointed about that. That's actually a hell of an achievement, because I think we've made a connection that a lot of critics who are writing about Get Out, lauding it justifiably so, never did. Like, I never read a review that was like, oh, Get Out is fantastic, but it's just like Dr. Caligari. No, we did that. So I mean, I don't want to be too self-congratulatory or anything, but I do want to sort of resist that point that we're not celebrating, because I think we really are celebrating modern horror films.
No, that's fantastic. I'm going to send this podcast to Jordan Peele and be like, you need to clearly share this, because we have built off of history, and you have as well. And this is clearly an indication of your expertise. So yeah, I'm sending this to Jordan Peele. Thanks, Jim. That my ego has been boosted enough to be able to do that. Thank you.
Well, if he actually watches it, hey, Jordan, we love your work and Get Out. Can't wait to see your next film.
Do you guys have anything else you want to add before we close up shop? Okay, cool. Well, yeah, I mean,
I mean, do we want to do our overall ratings and all that?
yeah, let's do our overall rating. I'll start just because I picked this film. God, I picked most of these films. And this is one of the earlier ones. I'm realizing the more I pick, the earlier I go back. I just, you know what? Early 2017 Noah, don't listen to him. If you watch the earlier podcasts, fuck him. He's an ass. He doesn't know what he's talking about. This is the Noah you want to listen to. Yeah, man. So, goddamn, man, this movie really messed me up. It really did. I mean, so there's I don't want to get too far into this, but there's apparently like a 4K version of this film. I watched the 1080p version. I tried to do like, okay, if I'm going to watch this film in 2017, let's watch the most like up-to-date, updated, audio sounds great, video looks amazing version. And I got to experience that on my projector in 1080p. I didn't get to watch it in 4K, but I got to watch it in 1080p with the soundtrack. This is one of those conversations I hate to have just because I know the soundtrack can be different depending on the version that you watch. But I think we all probably watched the same or listened to the same soundtrack. And it was unbelievably mesmerizing. It was fantastic. And this movie left me feeling distorted. Like there was a kind of, like it was kind of matrixy sort of reality is shifted under my feet. I wasn't expecting. I thought this was a very modernist sort of movie when I went to watch it originally. And what I ended up coming away with was like questions and question marks and like, wait a minute, didn't expect that. What the fuck? And it's 100 years ago that this movie was made, and it really messed me up. And I think there's some value in that I expect that now, but I don't expect that back then. There was a real, I mean, not to get too poetic, but I felt like I was in a sense hypnotized by this film. I was yesterday while I watched this film. And even at the end of the movie, I questioned, wait, was Caligari, was he an insane inmate or was he legitimately the director? And I had questions at the end of it. And I just thought to myself, like, this wasn't the same in The Phantom Carriage. This wasn't the same in some of the early films that we've talked about in this podcast. And it made me think. It put a stone in my shoe, which is one of the criteria for me thinking that a film is scary and worthwhile. And aesthetically, this film may be the best horror film I've ever seen. So like across the board, holy fuck, guys. Like I want to rate this like almost higher than It Follows. Like I'd give this, boy, I hate to say this being recorded, but I'd give this like a 9.7 across the board, like a 9.5, 9.7. We'll go with a 9.7 out of 10, which may be my highest rated film ever. I mean, legitimately ever, in the sense that it confused me. It threw me off. It was a great detective film. You know, one of the things we didn't talk about is like the little sequences that says, I am Caligari or you are Caligari, where it's the text that appears at the end of the film where Caligari, where the director of the insane asylum is like seeing it everywhere. And I'm thinking that's hard. Like I can think of films where that sort of like Fringe. I'm a huge fan of the show Fringe, and that sort of stuff is done now in films like Fringe, like 5 years ago. So like 100 years ago, they were able to instantiate that same appeal, that same cinematic sort of mesmerization in a movie. And I'm like, that deserves so much, man. Like 100. Think of all the technological innovations we've had in the last 100 years. And to think of seeing text appear, oh, you're looking this way. You are I am Caligari. Looking this way, I am Caligari. And the text is like curved. And it's like, that is not only cinematically unbelievable, but just the way it was thrown into the movie was perfect. So I got to give this a 9 points. Ben's going to kill me because this is higher than I rated The Seventh Seal, but like truly a 9.7 out of 10. Probably the highest rated horror film I think I've ever seen. So I'm going to start this off really high, and I know probably all of you will rate this a little lower than me, but honestly, like a classic. I don't know if one can beat this. It's one of those earliest cinematic masterpieces that I just don't know how to beat even now. So 9.7 across the board in terms of fear, in terms of the question mark that it throws at me. It doesn't really even touch upon ideas like death, like some of the films that get to me, but just the question mark that puts over everything about interpretation and just some of the uniqueness of it. I give it a 9.7. Give it a high score. What about you guys?
I guess I'll go. The fact that this movie was made almost 100 years ago and still is so timeless is super important to me. This is one of the reasons why, even though I really love Phantom Carriage and I think the story is so interesting and makes me think and I love it, it still is not quite as layered and as intelligent as this film, nor is it as artistic and beautiful. But I like that the idea is about obsessing over power and about how that power can lead to tyranny, that it reflects on how man is always comparing their sizes, I guess you would say, with their size of stool or their size of hat or maybe their size of other things, who knows, but there's a lot of competition, and I don't know, just the fact that you get to that place of insanity. You know, you get crazy thinking about who's in charge, if you should probably be the person in charge. I know that almost every person I've ever talked to has been like, well, if I was in charge, if I was the main tyrant of this earth, things would be better. It goes into that primal, egotistical place in all of our hearts that we all want to go to. And then you probably see that we're just all crazy ape people that probably wouldn't do so well in that position anyway. But it's definitely fascinating to think about, and probably one of the most beautiful and most poignant films I've ever seen. So here is a first and possibly an only 10 from Shayra on a film.
Wow.
Holy shit, call the presses, folks.
Yeah. Yeah, that's wild. If anyone of you gives it like a 5 or a 6, you may just be killed outright. So
I'm going 1 for this anti-Semitic piece of fuck this movie. Fuck everybody the Nazi who made. No, I'm all right.
Jim, you gave it a
I'm
point.
editing
Why isn't
that.
it a 0?
Right, good point. Yeah, it's a -10. No, I'm joking.
I'm editing this, by the way. I'm going to take this and edit just that part and
Just my fuck this movie. All right, yeah, that'd be great. I'll be memed immediately. It'll be very upsetting. I'm at an. I said, like, I was at an 8 before you guys started talking, and then you guys started talking. I'm like, no, I got up this is a 9, because I can't disagree with anything that you said. It's a 9 for me. One of the things that I wish would have happened, if I'm being uber critical, is I wish one of the twists would have come earlier in the film, because there was a point halfway through the film when I was like, there's not, like, this is a straight story, and I don't understand what's going to be so special about this film at the end. And then it hit me once, and then it hit me again, and it seemed like those 2 hits came too close together. And that's just, and that's because I need to not give it a 10. Like, as a structural thing, I wish one of the twists had just come like 5-10 minutes earlier. And that's a rather mild criticism in what is overall a fantastic movie, a great horror film, the first horror film, and possibly one of the, as we've been discussing, one of the first postmodern films. So I'd highly recommend it. And I think this is the highest rating I've ever given on one of these podcasts. So there you go.
woo-hoo. Don't fuck it up, Ben. Don't do it.
I won't. I will not fuck it up. However, I might end up giving this the lowest scored. I don't think it's going to be low. Yeah. All right. We'll see. Okay, let me give my reasons. Okay. So obviously, like we brought up the 7th seal, or at least Noah did. He mentioned that. Yeah, that's my 10. And it's okay that you give this a higher rating than that. I think the bar for me, 9 and above, is going to be some kind of category that I really can't name. It's going to be some kind of emotional appeal that, like, something when I view it, it just hooks me and pulls me in some personal way, and just like really seems to understand me without actually, being specifically for me. Like, I mean, it becomes a symbol that reflects something within me that maybe I didn't recognize, or that maybe nothing else can seem to touch. I don't necessarily know if this does that. That being said, I can't think of a way that I could improve this in order for that to happen. Um, the film is visually striking. It's incredible. It's absolutely incredible. I love what they did with the perspective, like I mentioned earlier. The way that they set up the scenes is gorgeous, and I can't believe this film was created in the 1920s. Like, it seems like the story itself is a modern story, like all the things that we've mentioned already. But really, I mean, what I'm going to have to end up giving this is maybe like close to something like an 8.5. And that's primarily just because of that, like that one artistic piece. I don't think it speaks to a personal fear to me. That being said, whenever I first watched this, obviously the first time I watched it, like just earlier today, I wanted to make sure the experience was fresh. There's so much historical context to this that I don't think my perspective on the film can do it justice. I don't think what I saw in it is its true depth. And so that score might not necessarily reflect the true sort of greatness of this film, because it is truly great and it is truly timeless. And honestly, I haven't seen Get Out either quite yet. I know that seems ridiculous. I'll have to watch that now to be able to compare it and actually make this connection that you guys are making to see whether or not it's been truly bested within all this context. But damn, yeah, I mean, there's so much to this. I didn't expect the twist at the end. It genuinely did catch me by surprise. Everything about the storytelling, everything about the way the shots were set up. Yes, there's so much in this movie that is iconic, drawn out into stuff that you'll see today. But I do wish that we saw more stuff like this, right? Like, I mean, I know there are some, like we mentioned, there are a couple examples that kind of touch on these themes, but I think the spread, or if you look at the scatter plot of all horror films across time, I think we've gotten quite broad. And I would like to see the genre of horror as a whole come closer to the significance that a film like this can offer. There's social commentary. There's a mirror there that speaks to the personal fears of some of the people that watch it. The storytelling is smart. It's complex. It's visually striking. I don't think we see that enough today. I think a lot of people that view the genre and like are fans of just horror in general are probably going to be satisfied with like a Sharknado, and like you see people being impressed by this what I might call bullshit in podcasts, for instance, like, Bloodbath and Beyond. Like, if you see some of these other podcasts that talk about horror films, that's kind of what they're going after, but that just doesn't cut it for me. Something like this really just it's incredible. It's an incredible film. The only criticism that I have is that intangible factor that I can't explain, and it just didn't hook into me like it might have others. But there's literally nothing I can really say bad about the film.
That's fair. Like my initial was an 8 for just some of the reasons that you were articulating. So I think that's a fair reading, and it sort of speaks to the subjective responses that a lot of us have toward art. So don't kill him, Noah, for giving it an 8.
No, he's already dead to me. Your 9.5 has been recorded. Don't even try to go back. You're done. 9.5 on you, Jim.
Wait, can I throw something in and see if any of your things go up?
Go for it.
It's very short, but this is also the movie that inspired the noir film genre with all the shadows and stuff, and obviously it's a murder mystery, but all those dark shadows on people, the way that Noah looks right now, he's representing that very well because of Caligari. So without Caligari, we wouldn't have Noah's face looking so epic. So thank you, Dr. Caligari. Does that, by any chance, raise your score at all?
I do love Noah's face. That might be
11 out of 10. I'm going to score it for him. 11 out of 10. Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Ben.
Look, now Jim's doing it. It's perfect.
I figured I'd join the club.
That's very fair, Ben. I think that's yeah, I mean, that's dead on, right? Like there's sort of like a, what did she ever call it? Like the it factor. We were making fun of the current it, which I'm not going to talk about because we're not going to get any more downvotes. The factor, the it factor, something that's there that speaks to you. I get that. I totally get that, Ben. yeah, like a timeless piece, an imperfect timeless piece. I'm right there with you. There is something to be said about an issue that speaks to you in a way that maybe a film that's even timeless doesn't have. Death, or like living forever. This is one of those things we're gonna kind of maybe pursue in a sequence of current interviews and other films, hint, that we'll have coming out in the future. But yeah, like I get that. You want to sort of score a film highly given its historical cinematic value, but also in relation to how much it speaks to you in terms of how much it scares you, in terms of your subjective experience with the way the world is and what makes you go, oh God, that freaks me the fuck out. It's something that I think about, it's something I go to bed thinking about, it's something that persists and it lasts. So I completely get that. That said, I didn't hear anything you said, and I heard 10 out of 10. Was it 10 out? I heard 10 out of 10. So we're just gonna go with that, Ben. Yeah. So no. So thank you for watching this podcast. This was a really good episode. We are actually taking a break for the next week. We're going to have some videos uploaded in the next week. Some individual posts from like Ben and Shayra and maybe some other people. It just depends in the next 7 days. But in 2 weeks, we are doing a lecture, proper lecture from one of our co-hosts, Garrett Merriam, who is a professor of philosophy at Sacramento State. Used to work at Jim's university, but he was smart and he moved to the West Coast, which is what you do when you're intelligent, Jim. I don't know if you know that. You move this way towards...
Or the East Coast?
Yeah. No, my
No,
understanding
just the West
scientifically
Coast.
is the West Coast. There's some rappers that have like talked about this ad infinitum. I don't know if you've heard of them. But anyway, yeah. So he's moved this way. So he's going to do a lecture on the philosophy of horror, which would be really fun. And then after that, we are doing Cabinet. We're going like 100 years in the future from this film, and we're doing The Cabin in the Woods, which I think is in early November, and then also The Thing in the 1980s, which is probably the most Lovecraftian film that we've done, and I will definitely be there no matter where I'm at, because I'm a huge Lovecraft fan. I'm a huge The Thing fan, and so this will be a really interesting one. So if you like what we've done, check us out. Subscribe to us. Like, what's the matter with you? If you haven't subscribe to us, damn it, on YouTube. Check us out on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. We're pretty active on Twitter. And we're trying to produce content about once a week. So check us out on those mediums if you liked what you saw. And join us in 2 weeks for The Philosophy of Horror, a more proper introduction into the world of philosophy and into horror, a historical perspective, a philosophical perspective from someone who is well learned in this discipline. So check us out. Take care, and I hope you liked what you saw. Join us in 2 weeks for that, and have a good night. Hope you like what you saw. Peace.